Hello everyone. Welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. I was standing outside the conference room, my laptop balanced against my hip when I heard my name followed by the words that would change everything. Jenner thinks she's so smart with all her psychology nonsense. Director Holbrook whispered. Time to show her what happens when consultants get too comfortable. My breath caught. Through the slightly open door, I could see three figures hunched around the oval table. Holbrook and his two most loyal senior managers, Prescott and Zimmer. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it. Phase 1, Prescott continued, his voice low but clear. We start spreading whispers about her methods being inappropriate. Nothing specific enough to get us in trouble, just enough to make people question her credibility. Then Phase 2, Zimmer added with satisfaction. We overload her with impossible deadlines and contradictory demands. When she starts struggling, we document everything as performance issues. In Phase 3, Holbrook's tone held dark satisfaction. We terminate her for inability to meet professional standards. Clean, simple, and completely defensible. I felt the walls closing in around me. These weren't just threats. This was a calculated plan to destroy my career, my reputation, everything I'd worked 15 years to build. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of crumbling, something fierce awakened inside me because they had no idea what I actually knew about them. My name is Jenner Marrow. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent my entire career reading people like open books. What started as survival growing up with an alcoholic father became my superpower. I can spot manipulation, hidden agendas, and toxic dynamics from a mile away. Let me pause for a moment here. Before I go any further, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you are watching from? I want to know how far my story has reached. And please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. Because what happened next is something I never could have imagined. 3 months earlier, I'd been hired as an organizational psychology consultant to help this mid-sized tech consulting firm address what they called culture issues. The HR director, a genuinely kind woman named Patricia, had reached out after their employee satisfaction scores plummeted and several harassment complaints were filed. From my first day walking through their open plan office, I could feel the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Employees kept their heads down. Conversations died when certain people approached. And there was this underlying current of fear that made my skin crawl. I'd seen toxic workplaces before, but this felt different, more systematic, more deliberate. During my initial interviews with staff members, the same themes kept emerging. People described feeling watched, targeted, and expendable. But when I asked for specifics, they'd clam up, their eyes darting toward the corner offices where Holbrook, Prescott, and Zimmer held court. So I started paying closer attention to those three. Holbrook was the mastermind, a silver-haired man in his 50s who'd built the company from nothing and ruled it like his personal kingdom. He had this way of making people feel simultaneously special and terrified depending on his mood. Employees called him charming to his face and the puppet master behind his back. Prescott was his enforcer, a sharp-featured woman who managed operations with ruthless efficiency. She had perfected the art of the compliment wrap threat, always delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Zimmer handled sales and client relations, and he was perhaps the most dangerous because he appeared harmless, soft-spoken, always helpful, the kind of person who remembered your kid's birthday while simultaneously documenting your every misstep. Together, they formed what employees had started calling the Trinity, three people who seemed to operate with one mind and zero accountability. My job was supposed to be straightforward. Conduct interviews, observe workplace dynamics, identify problem areas, and provide recommendations for improvement. Standard corporate culture consulting. But the more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just about poor management or communication issues. This was about systematic psychological manipulation designed to keep employees compliant and controllable. I discovered they had a rotation system for targeting specific employees. Someone would be selected, usually someone who showed leadership potential or asked too many questions, and all three would focus their attention on slowly undermining that person's confidence and credibility. They'd start with small things, questioning decisions, that had previously been praised, excluding the target from important meetings while insisting it was just an oversight, gradually increasing workload while cutting resources. The most insidious part was how they made each target believe they were the problem. By the time someone reached their breaking point, they were so convinced of their own inadequacy that they'd quit rather than fight back. I watched them do it to 3 different people during my first 2 months there. Each time I documented everything, not just the obvious harassment, but the psychological techniques they were using, the way they'd triangulate information to create confusion, how they'd use intermittent reinforcement to keep people off balance, the carefully timed praise designed to make their criticism hit harder. As a psychology consultant, I was supposed to remain neutral, professional, objective. But as a human being watching other human beings being systematically destroyed, I felt something burning in my chest that had nothing to do with professionalism. The breaking point came when I learned about Meyer. Meyer had been a junior developer who'd been fired 6 months before I arrived. According to the official record, she'd failed to meet performance standards and had become difficult to work with. But when I dug deeper, I found a different story. Meyer had discovered that the company was systematically underpaying female employees compared to their male counterparts. Not just a little. We're talking about differences of $15,000 to $20,000 for identical roles and experience levels. She'd tried to address it through proper channels, approaching HR and her direct supervisor. Instead of investigating our concerns, they'd started the targeting process. Within 3 months, Meyer went from being a rising star to being painted as incompetent and insubordinate. They documented every minor mistake while ignoring her successes. They excluded her from team communications and then criticized her for being out of the loop. The final blow came when they accused her of violating company policy by discussing salary information with coworkers, something that was actually protected by federal law. But Meyer was too young and too overwhelmed to know that. She was terminated on a Friday afternoon, escorted out by security while her former colleagues watched in horrified silence. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge us. Meyer's story broke something inside me, but it also crystallized my understanding of what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just workplace toxicity. This was organized psychological warfare, and now they were turning those same weapons on me. As I stood outside that conference room listening to them plot my destruction, I realized something they hadn't counted on. I knew exactly how their system worked because I'd been studying it for 3 months. More importantly, I had something they didn't know about: the trust of almost everyone they'd ever wronged. During my interviews and observations, I hadn't just been gathering data. I'd been building relationships. People had started confiding in me, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. I'd become a repository for years of buried trauma and suppressed anger. They thought they were eliminating a threat, but they were actually awakening something much more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything necessary to bring them down. The next morning, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed. I smiled at Holbrook when he greeted me in the hallway. I nodded professionally to Prescott during our regular check-in meeting. I even accepted Zimmer's offer to grab coffee and discuss my progress. But inside, I was no longer the consultant trying to help them fix their culture problems. I was a hunter who had finally identified her prey. My first move was to accelerate something I'd already been planning, a series of leadership development workshops for employees at all levels. When I pitched the idea to Holbrook, I positioned it as a way to help their staff develop better communication and conflict resolution skills. "Brilliant idea, Jenner," he said with that practiced smile. "Always thinking ahead. That's why we hired you." If only he knew. I scheduled the first workshop for the following week, sending invitations to 30 employees across different departments. The topic was recognizing and responding to workplace manipulation, which I disguised in the official invitation as advanced communication strategies. I expected maybe 15 people to show up. 43 came. They filled the conference room and spilled into the hallway. People who rarely spoke to each other sat side by side. The energy in the room was electric, not excited, but charged with something deeper. Recognition, validation, hope. I started with basic concepts: how to identify manipulation tactics, the the psychology behind gaslighting, the difference between healthy authority and toxic control. I kept everything clinical and educational, never mentioning specific people or situations. But as I talked about triangulation, the practice of using third parties to manipulate relationships, I saw heads nodding throughout the room. When I explained intermittent reinforcement and how it creates psychological dependence, I watched people exchange knowing glances. And when I described the isolation tactics used to break down individual resistance, the silence in the room became deafening. Does anyone have questions about these concepts? I asked. Slowly, tentatively, hands began to rise. But if someone asked, what if you recognize these patterns in your own workplace? What do you do then? That's when the floodgates opened. One by one, people began sharing their experiences, not naming names, not yet, but describing situations that everyone in the room immediately recognized. The midnight emails with impossible deadlines, the meetings where they'd be criticized for things they'd been praised for the week before, the slow erosion of confidence that left them questioning their own competence. I facilitated the discussion like a therapy session, helping people understand that their experiences were valid, that the patterns they'd noticed were real, and most importantly, that they weren't alone. By the end of that first workshop, something fundamental had shifted. These employees weren't just isolated individuals anymore. They were a group, a community, a force. And Holbrook, Prescott, and Zimmer had no idea what was building right under their noses. The second workshop drew 60 people. The third brought in staff from other branches who'd heard about what was happening. By the fourth week, I was running 2 sessions to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Meanwhile, phase 1 of their plan against me had begun. Prescott started the whispers during a leadership team meeting I wasn't invited to. I heard about it from Patricia, who was disturbed by the implications. She suggested that your methods might be creating division rather than unity. Patricia told me privately. She didn't make any specific accusations, but she planted the seed that maybe your workshops were causing more problems than they were solving. Phase 1 was subtle, designed to undermine confidence in my approach without giving me anything concrete to fight back against. In their previous campaigns, this gradual erosion of credibility had been devastatingly effective, but they were dealing with someone who understood their playbook. Instead of becoming defensive or trying to counter their whispers directly, I did something unexpected. I invited them to observe my workshops. I've heard there might be some concerns about my approach. I told Holbrook during our weekly check-in, I'd love to have you and your leadership team attend a session so you can see firsthand what we're accomplishing. He couldn't refuse without appearing unreasonable. So the following Tuesday, all 3 of them filed into the back of the conference room to watch me work. I had planned the session carefully. The topic was building resilient team dynamics, and I focused on research-backed strategies for creating psychologically safe workplaces. Everything I presented was mainstream organizational psychology, the kind of content you'd find in any MBA program or corporate training manual. Nothing radical or controversial, but I made sure to include case studies of toxic leadership, behaviors drawn from academic research and carefully anonymized. I talked about leaders who used fear as a motivational tool. I described organizations where information was hoarded and used as a weapon. I outlined the psychological impact of unpredictable feedback and arbitrary decision-making. I watched their faces as I spoke, the growing discomfort, the recognition, the dawning realization that I wasn't just describing abstract concepts. I was describing them. After the session, employees lingered to ask questions and share insights. The energy in the room was positive, constructive, empowering. Several people specifically thanked me for helping them understand concepts they'd never had words for before. Holbrook and his team left quietly, but I could see the wheels turning in their heads. That afternoon, Phase 2 began early. Zimmer appeared at my desk with a stack of urgent projects. 3 client reports that suddenly needed to be completely restructured. A comprehensive audit of the past year's HR practices that had to be completed by the end of the week. A request to provide detailed psychological profiles of 12 specific employees who were supposedly being considered for promotion. I know it seems like a lot, he said with false sympathy, but the executive team is really excited about your work and wants to expand your scope immediately. I accepted everything with professional grace, even as I calculated that completing all of these tasks to their usual standards would require about 90 hours of work in 5 days. But I had no intention of playing their game by their rules. Instead, I did something that would have terrified the old me. I started reaching out to the people they'd wronged. Not just current employees, but former ones. People who'd been driven out over the past few years. People who'd left broken and convinced they were the problem. I found Meyer first. She was working at a startup downtown, having rebuilt her career from scratch after her experience at our company. When I called her, she was immediately wary. "Why are you asking about that place?" She wanted to know. "I signed an NDA when I left. I can't talk about what happened. I'm not asking you to break any agreements." I told her, "I'm calling because I think you deserve to know that you were right about everything." That phone call lasted 3 hours. Meyer had suspected she was being targeted, but she'd never understood the systematic nature of what had happened to her. As I explained the patterns I'd observed, the deliberate tactics, the coordinated effort to undermine her credibility, I heard something shift in her voice. "I thought I was going crazy," she whispered. "I kept wondering what I'd done wrong, why I couldn't seem to do anything right anymore. I started seeing a therapist because I thought maybe I really was incompetent." "You weren't incompetent," I told her. "You were inconvenient. There is a difference." By the end of our conversation, Meyer wasn't just a former victim anymore. She was an ally, and she had documentation, emails, performance reviews, salary information that she'd kept despite the NDA because some part of her had known she might need it someday. Over the next week, while I juggled Zimmer's impossible assignments and continued running workshops, I quietly reached out to 8 other former employees. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Initial weariness followed by recognition, followed by relief, followed by anger. Clean, righteous anger at people who had stolen their confidence and derailed their careers for the crime of standing up for themselves. By Friday, when Zimmer appeared at my desk to collect the projects he assigned, I had built something Holbrook and his team never could have anticipated. A network of people who understood exactly what they were facing and were ready to do something about it. I handed over completed versions of every single assignment. Zimmer's face showed genuine surprise. He'd been expecting me to fail, to provide him with documentation of my inability to meet their unreasonable demands. Instead, I'd given him professionally executed work that met all of their specifications. Not my best work. I didn't have time for that, but competent, thorough, and completely defensible. "This is impressive," he admitted reluctantly. "Thank you," I replied. "I'm looking forward to your feedback." What he didn't know was that completing those assignments had been the easy part. The hard part had been what I was building in the shadows. Because while they'd been focused on destroying me, I'd been busy creating something they would never see coming, a coordinated response that would use their own tactics against them, delivered by the very people they thought they'd silenced forever. Phase 3 of their plan was about to begin, but so was mine, and they had no idea that the quiet consultant they decided to eliminate had just finished assembling the exact team needed to bring down their entire system. The following Monday morning, I walked into Holbrook's office for what I knew would be our final weekly check-in meeting. He was sitting behind his desk flanked by Prescott and Zimmer, their faces arranged in expressions of professional concern. "Jenner, please sit down," Holbrook began, his tone carefully modulated. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention." I sat, my laptop balanced on my knees, and waited. "It's come to our attention that your workshops may be having some unintended consequences," Prescott continued. "Several employees have expressed feeling confused about workplace dynamics, and there's been an increase in HR complaints since your sessions began." This was it. Phase 3, the final justification. They needed to terminate my contract. "I see," I said calmly. "Could you provide specifics about these concerns? I'd like to address any issues immediately." "Well," Zimmer interjected, "it's more about the overall atmosphere. People seem to be questioning leadership decisions more frequently, and there's been a decline in what we might call team cohesion." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their feedback seriously. That's interesting, I said, because my preliminary findings suggest something quite different. I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd been preparing for weeks. Based on my 3 months of observation and analysis, I've identified some concerning patterns that I believe are at the root of your culture issues. Their faces remained professionally neutral, but I caught the quick glance that passed between them. Would you like me to share my initial recommendations? Holbrook nodded, probably expecting a generic report about communication improvements and team-building exercises. Instead, I launched into the most dangerous presentation of my career. I've observed a systematic pattern of psychological manipulation that appears to be embedded in this organization's leadership structure. I began watching their faces carefully. This pattern follows a predictable cycle that begins with the identification of employees who demonstrate independent thinking or challenge existing processes. The room had gone completely silent. Once identified, these employees are subjected to a three-phase process designed to undermine their confidence and credibility. Phase 1 involves subtle questioning of their competence and spreading concerns about their work quality. Phase 2 escalates to unreasonable demands and impossible deadlines designed to create documented performance issues. Phase 3 culminates in termination based on the artificial performance problems created in Phase 2. Prescott's face had gone pale. Zimmer was staring at his hands. Holbrook's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This pattern has been repeated consistently over the past 18 months, I continued, and has resulted in the loss of several valuable employees who possessed knowledge or perspectives that certain leadership members found threatening. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of employee departures correlated with workplace complaints and documented performance issues. The psychological impact of this system extends far beyond the direct targets. Remaining employees exhibit classic symptoms of learned helplessness and hypervigilance associated with psychologically unsafe work environments. Another click brought up survey data showing the correlation between proximity to leadership and reported stress levels. My recommendation is immediate intervention to address these systemic issues before they result in legal liability or further talent loss. I closed the laptop and looked directly at Holbrook. Of course, implementing these changes would require buy-in from the entire leadership team, particularly those individuals whose behavior patterns would need to be modified. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Finally, Holbrook spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "This is a very serious allegation, Jenner. I hope you have substantial evidence to support these claims." "I have 3 months of detailed observations, documented incidents, and corroborating testimony from multiple sources," I replied. "Everything I've shared is based on behavioral data and established psychological research." What I didn't tell them was that I had something much more powerful than evidence. I had an audience. Because while they'd been plotting my destruction, I'd been building something they couldn't see and couldn't stop. A community of people who were done being silent. The workshop I'd scheduled for that afternoon would be different from all the others. Instead of discussing abstract concepts, we were going to talk about specific actions. Instead of building awareness, we were going to build strategy. And instead of hiding in the shadows, we were going to step into the light. As I walked out of Holbrook's office, I felt the weight of 15 years of consulting experience, 3 months of careful observation, and the trust of 47 current and former employees who were ready to reclaim their voices. They thought they were ending my story. They had no idea they'd just written the beginning of theirs. That afternoon, I stood at the front of the conference room watching people file in for what would become the most important workshop of my career. But this time, it wasn't just current employees. Meyer walked through the door first, her chin raised, in a way I'd never seen in any of our phone conversations. Behind her came Derek, a former project manager who'd been terminated for attitude problems after questioning budget discrepancies. Then Sarah Chen, who'd been pushed out for cultural misfit after reporting inappropriate comments from a client that leadership chose to ignore. One by one, they'd arrived. People who'd been broken down, gaslit, and discarded. People who'd spent months or years believing they were the problem. People who'd found their voices again through our conversations and were ready to use them. But the most powerful moment came when current employees began recognizing their former colleagues. I watched faces light up with understanding as connections formed between past departures and present fears. "Before we begin," I said, looking out at the packed room, "I want to acknowledge something. Everyone in this room has experienced or witnessed systematic workplace manipulation. Today, we are going to stop pretending it's normal." The energy shifted immediately. This wasn't a professional development session anymore. This was a reckoning. I started by sharing what I'd learned about the three-phase targeting system using anonymous case studies that everyone immediately recognized. As I described each tactic, I watched current employees turned to former ones with expressions of dawning comprehension. The midnight email demanding urgent revisions to work that had already been approved. I said, "Does that sound familiar to anyone?" Hands went up around the room. Stories started flowing. Not accusations, not yet, but shared experiences that painted an undeniable pattern. Meyer stood up suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "I need to say something," she announced. "When I was terminated 18 months ago, I was told I had performance issues. That I had documentation proving that my work was meeting all stated standards. I also had evidence that female employees in my department were being paid significantly less than men in equivalent positions." She looked directly at 3 current employees who'd been at the company when she left. I tried to address the pay disparity through proper channels. Within a week, my manager started finding problems with work that had been praised the month before. Within a month, I was being excluded from important meetings and then criticized for being out of the loop. Within 3 months, I was gone. The room was completely silent, but I could feel the electricity building. Derek spoke next, describing how he'd been isolated and overloaded after questioning why certain client contracts seemed to favor companies owned by leadership team members' relatives. Then Sarah shared how her attempts to report client harassment had been met with suggestions that she was misinterpreting professional interactions and might be happier in a different environment. Story after story, pattern after pattern, until the systematic nature of the destruction became impossible to deny. But I wasn't done yet. "Here's what I've learned in my 3 months here," I continued. "This isn't just about individual bad actors. This is about a deliberate system designed to eliminate anyone who might threaten the comfortable status quo." I clicked to a new slide showing the org chart with specific positions highlighted. Every person who's been targeted had one thing in common. They possessed information, skills, or perspectives that could expose problems leadership wanted to keep hidden. That's when I revealed the most damaging piece of evidence I'd uncovered. During my official assessment, I'd been given access to personnel files and performance reviews. What I'd found was a smoking gun that even I hadn't expected. Deliberate documentation, manipulation. I've discovered that performance reviews have been altered after the fact. I announced positive feedback has been removed and negative comments added, creating false paper trails to justify terminations. I showed them side-by-side comparisons of reviews I'd managed to access through the system versus copies that employees had saved from their original meetings. The differences were stark and undeniable. The room erupted. Current employees pulled out their phones, checking their own saved documents against official records. Former employees began realizing that their performance issues might have been artificially created. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia, the HR director, stood up with tears in her eyes. "I need to confess something," she said, her voice shaking. "I'd suspected some of these patterns for months, but I convinced myself I was imagining things. I've been complicit in this system because I was afraid of becoming its next target." She turned to face Meyer directly. "I owe you an apology. When you came to me about the pay disparity, I should have investigated immediately. Instead, I let them convince me you were being disruptive. I failed you, and I failed everyone else who came to me for help." That confession broke something open in the room. Other people began admitting their own complicity, their own fear-driven silence. The conversation shifted from sharing experiences to planning action. Someone suggested filing a group complaint with the Department of Labor. Another person mentioned contacting an employment attorney. A third proposed reaching out to industry publications about the systematic harassment. But Meyer had a different idea. What if we use their own tactics against them? She asked quietly. The room went silent, waiting for her to continue. They've been manipulating information to control narratives, she explained. What if we started controlling the narrative instead? That's when I realized Meyer understood something the rest of us were still grasping. The most effective revenge wouldn't be legal action or public exposure. It would be giving them a taste of their own medicine. Over the next hour, we developed a strategy that was both elegant and devastating in its simplicity. Instead of confronting them directly, we would document everything, every interaction, every decision, every contradiction between their public statements and private actions. We would use the same systematic approach they'd perfected, but in reverse. Instead of isolating targets, we would build community. Instead of creating false documentation, we would preserve accurate records. Instead of manipulating information, we would ensure transparency. The plan had 3 phases just like theirs. Phase 1, documentation and verification. Everyone would start keeping detailed records of interactions with leadership. We would cross-reference stories, compare experiences, and build an unshakable foundation of evidence. Phase 2, strategic positioning. We would use the company's own systems against them. Anonymous feedback surveys, official complaint processes, documented requests for clarification on policy contradictions. Phase 3, coordinated revelation. When we had everything we needed, we would present our findings not as accusations, but as a comprehensive analysis of systemic dysfunction requiring immediate intervention. But there was one more element to our plan that none of them saw coming. As the workshop ended and people began filing out, I received a text message that made my heart race. Emergency leadership meeting called for tomorrow morning. Your contract is being terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out at 9:00 a.m. It was from Patricia, who'd clearly been instructed to notify me, but chose to give me advanced warning instead. They were accelerating their timeline. Phase 3 of their plan was happening 12 hours early, but I was ready for this too. That evening, I worked until 3:00 a.m., preparing something I'd been planning since the day I overheard them plotting my destruction, a comprehensive report documenting everything I discovered, formatted as an official consulting recommendation, and copied to every single person in the company. But this wasn't just a list of problems. It was a roadmap for transformation that positioned the employees themselves as the solution. I called it organizational healing through employee empowerment. And I structured it like any other corporate consulting document. Professional language, research citations, implementation timelines, everything designed to look like exactly the kind of report they'd hired me to produce. Except this report recommended dismantling their entire system of control. At 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes before security was scheduled to escort me out, I sent the report to every company email address, uploaded it to the shared drive, and posted it on the internal bulletin board system. By 9:00 a.m., when Holbrook, Prescott, and Zimmer arrived to watch my humiliation, the entire company was reading my final recommendation. The security guard, who'd been called to escort me out, looked confused when I handed him my badge and laptop with a smile. "That's it?" he asked. "No problems?" "No problems at all." I told him, "My work here is finished." I could see the 3 of them, through the glass walls of the conference room, frantically trying to figure out how to respond to what I just unleashed. Because my report hadn't accused them of anything. It had simply documented patterns of behavior and recommended evidence-based solutions for creating a healthier workplace culture. Everything in it was professionally appropriate, legally sound, and completely devastating to their power structure. I walked out of that building knowing I'd planted a seed that would grow into something they could never contain. Over the next week, I watched from the outside as their world began to crumble. It started with questions. Employees began asking for clarification on policies that had always been deliberately vague. They requested documentation for decisions that had never been documented. They formed committees to address issues that leadership had always handled privately. The beauty of my final report was that it gave employees language and frameworks for challenging the system without ever appearing insubordinate. Everything was couched in terms of organizational improvement and best practices. But the real power came from the community we'd built in those workshops. People who'd been isolated and intimidated were now connected and coordinated. Instead of suffering in silence, they were sharing information and supporting each other. When Prescott tried to overload one employee with impossible deadlines, 5 other people volunteered to help distribute the work. When Zimmer attempted to exclude someone from important meetings, others began forwarding notes and updates. When Holbrook tried to question someone's competence, colleagues stepped forward with documented evidence of their achievements. The systematic manipulation that had worked so effectively on isolated individuals fell apart when faced with a united group, but the final blow came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after my termination, Meyer called me with news that made my hands shake. "You need to see this," she said, forwarding me a link to a local business journal article. The headline read, "Tech consulting firm under investigation for systematic harassment and discrimination." The article described a coordinated complaint filed with multiple regulatory agencies by current and former employees, supported by extensive documentation of policy violations and discriminatory practices. But what made my breath catch was the quote at the end of the article. This investigation was prompted by a comprehensive organizational assessment that revealed systematic patterns of workplace manipulation and retaliation, said a spokesperson for the Department of Labor. The documentation provided by employees shows a clear pattern of targeting individuals who attempted to report policy violations or advocate for workplace improvements. They were going down, not just facing minor penalties or slaps on the wrist, but serious legal consequences that would follow them for years. Within a month, all 3 were facing individual investigations. Holbrook was forced to step down as director while the company underwent federal oversight. Prescott was transferred to a branch office in another state, effectively ending her influence over company operations. Zimmer was terminated after investigators discovered he'd been using company resources for personal business ventures. But the most satisfying part wasn't their professional destruction. It was watching the company transform into something healthy. Patricia was promoted to interim director and immediately began implementing the recommendations from my final report. Employee satisfaction scores soared as policies became transparent and accountability systems were established. Meyer was invited back to her old position with a significant raise and a formal apology from the board of directors. Derek returned as a consultant to help redesign their project management systems. Sarah became their new HR specialist for harassment prevention. The company that had been built on fear and manipulation became a model for ethical leadership and employee empowerment. And it all started because 3 people decided to plot my destruction in a conference room with the door slightly open. The irony still makes me smile. They thought they were eliminating a threat to their system. Instead, they handed me the exact information I needed to burn that system to the ground and build something better from the ashes. 6 months later, I was invited back to speak at their annual company meeting, not as a consultant this time, but as a guest speaker on the topic of building resilient workplace communities. Standing at the front of that same conference room where I'd first heard my name whispered with malicious intent, I looked out at faces that radiated confidence instead of fear. These weren't broken people anymore. They were empowered individuals who'd learned they had more strength together than their oppressors ever had alone. The most important thing I learned during my time here, I told them, is that toxic systems only survive when good people stay isolated and silent. The moment you start connecting, sharing truth, and supporting each other, those systems become powerless. I paused, thinking about that night 3 months earlier when I'd stood outside a conference room and heard 3 people casually planning my professional destruction. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone underestimate exactly how dangerous you can be when you stop playing by their rules. The applause that followed felt like vindication for every person who'd ever been gaslit, manipulated, or discarded by people who thought their power made them untouchable. After my speech, Meyer approached me with a smile that lit up her entire face. "You know what the best part is?" she said. "They created their own destruction. All you did was give us the tools to see what was happening and the courage to do something about it." She was right. I hadn't destroyed them. I'd simply held up a mirror and let their reflection destroy them. As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about all the people who are still trapped in toxic systems, convinced they are powerless, believing they are the problem. I thought about the managers and directors and executives who think their positions protect them from consequences. And I thought about the beautiful, terrible truth that had changed everything for me. Knowledge is only powerful when it's shared, but once it's shared, it becomes unstoppable. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns in your own workplace, if you're feeling isolated and manipulated and convinced you're going crazy, please know this. You're not alone. You're not imagining things. And you're not powerless. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Find your community. And remember that the people who seem most untouchable are often the ones with the most to hide. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to stay silent when it mattered most. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced workplace manipulation. And sharing our stories is how we break these cycles. And if you're currently living through something similar, please be safe, be smart, and remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let them destroy your spirit. They might think they've won when they drive you out, but they have no idea what you're capable of building once you're free. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.